Thank you so much, Thomas, and thank you for coming to those who are online already. My name is Stefanie Teggemann. As Thomas mentioned, I recently joined the KlimaUnion. I've been a member of the CDU since 2012. And a few years ago, I started thinking about the climate issue, figuring that this is something that we need to solve as mankind. And I guess, thousands and millions of people around the globe have been engaged in coming up with ways of addressing it. And when I got into this a few years ago, I chanced upon Peter Fikowski, who wrote a book called Climate Restoration, and I read his book, and there I found a very constructive way of dealing with the climate issue, basically looking at the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and identifying solutions for drawing CO2 from the atmosphere. And this is not a substitute to a net zero policy, but it's an addition to it because we're running out of time. Now, in this context, I had the opportunity to also meet Brent, and was very taken by his company that he founded and his approach of basically pulling CO2 from the atmosphere and turning it into synthetic limestone. One of the many patents that he has created over the course of his life. I think you've created a total number of 150 patents, so that's very impressive, Brent. Um, and I'm very happy that you're able to join us here. You're based in California, so a good morning to you. And yeah, we look forward to your presentation where you'll give us an overview of, the innovation that you basically came up with, how it works, what the benefits are, and where your company is at in terms of rollout. What else should I tell people about you? You're the founder and chief executive of the Blue Planet Systems, and you have founded and led several innovative companies around the topic of mineralization. And you have a PhD in earth sciences from the University of California at Santa Barbara. And as I mentioned, 150 US patents that really go back to your innovative spirit. And we're very excited to hear from you, Brent. We said when we had a prep call around 30 minutes for your input, and then we'll open it up to questions. Over to you.
Great. Well, thanks very much. It's nice to join you. I do have to mention that of the $40 million we've put into this project so far, most of it's come from Germany and Switzerland. So the majority of our shareholders are from German speaking. The I like to review the sort of basic facts of carbon because they're not really that well understood, but they're quite simple. If we look at carbon on Earth, there's about 830 billion tons of carbon in Earth's atmosphere. And just for reference, 6 million blue whales weigh about 1 gigaton. If you look in all the soils, all the terrestrial plant tissue, um, there's about 2,400 billion tons of carbon. If you go to the oceans, lakes, ice caps, rivers, there are about 38,000 billion tons of carbon in the oceans. But if you go to the lithosphere, the upper crust of the Earth, there's over 100 million billion tons of carbon, and it's mostly in limestone. And that's where most of Earth's carbon is. As you can see, there's very, very little in the atmosphere. There's not much in all the terrestrial plant tissue and soil.
Sorry,
Uh,
Brent, for interruption, but could you make it a bigger presentation if you don't
uh,
mind, so we could
sure.
easier see it? Yeah, exactly.
Basically,
Oh, great.
yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Then it's easier to see it
Yeah.
on the screen. Thanks.
Thank you, Thomas. I appreciate that. Uh, so this is the distribution of carbon on Earth today. And it takes many different forms. It's not all CO2 or as I think most of you know, CO2 is a common form of carbon in the atmosphere, but more common is bicarbonate, which is what we find in water, like the oceans and groundwater. Uh, there's a number of complex organic compounds where a lot of biological tissue holds it, but it's not a lot. But far and away, most of Earth's carbon is in the form of carbonate, and it's a stable form of carbon, and that's what limestone is, calcium carbonate. So identifying it, if you look at the lithosphere, the 100 million billion tons of carbon are in carbonate mineral, mainly calcium carbonate. So that's already the most stable place for carbon to be stored on the planet by far. And the problem is fairly obvious. If you take all of the efforts to mitigate carbon today, it's about 400 million tons or zero point 0.4 gigatons. But the size of the problem is about 40 gigatons. So with all the efforts to mitigate climate change today, if you add them all up, they add up to a fraction of a gigaton, which means even if they were all implemented, they probably have no effect. And there's a whole host of solutions that people have looked at, from biomass to wetlands, and they're all important and they're all having an impact. But it's off by an order of magnitude. We're addressing what is a gigaton problem with kiloton capable solutions. So we're off by a few orders of magnitude in terms of the scale of our response to climate change. And if you look at what's out there today, there's direct air capture. It's very popular. It's been funded by governments. But a typical direct air capture unit, the hope is to get up to maybe 1 megaton of CO2 from one unit. There's 1,000 megatons in 1 gigaton. And in the world today, there's a handful of direct air capture facilities, and they're not even in the megaton range. They're in the kiloton at the best. And some are in single digits as well. And we know that because we've been approached by them because they have nothing to do with the CO2, really, and they want us to mineralize it for them. There's a lot of different approaches to capturing carbon, in the form of CO2 to purify as well. But again, there's an issue about what to do with the CO2 once it's found. If we really want to get to megaton or gigaton levels, we need a major reservoir. Sustainable aviation fuel isn't going to make any difference, and it's not going to get us to gigaton levels of sequestration and these sort of things. And then taking CO2 and storing it geologically has become a business that's run by subsidies. But again, it's a place where we can't possibly get to a gigaton level. We're looking at aggregate as a good solution for storing the CO2. This is an article from the journal Science, which is a well-respected, well-read international journal. And it came out in January of this year, and it talks about the storage of carbon in the built environment. And if you look at column A, what column A shows is a number of different biomaterials construction materials that are capable of storing carbon. And the small dot in the middle is the minimum amount that it can store, and the outer circle is the maximum amount. But all these materials can store carbon and can be used in the built environment, from wood to concrete. However, the size of the markets in column B vary dramatically. And I think you can see that carbonate-based aggregate, the second one down, exceeds all the others put together. It's roughly 10 times more carbon that can be stored. And it's simply because there's over 50 gigatons of limestone mined every year, mostly for aggregate for concrete. And it's done in every place that humans are in the world. The aggregate is mainly used for concrete, it's used for asphalt, it's used for road base, but it's mostly limestone and it's mostly used for concrete. Okay. Let's see here. Doesn't want to advance when I Okay, sorry. Here you can see the actual numbers. So there's approximately 10 gigatons of storage potential of carbon in concrete aggregate. So for reference, go back to the whale slide that I showed. There are 830 gigatons of carbon in Earth's atmosphere. But that's equivalent to maybe 2,000 gigatons of CO2. But humans are putting out 40 gigatons, and there's the capacity to store 10 gigatons in limestone alone. So we've taken another approach. On the left is Blue Planet's approach. We capture CO2, and one thing that differentiates what we do is we don't purify it because at no point do we need to liquefy it or transport it. We simply convert it from CO2 to CO3, which is the main form of carbonate on Earth by far. Like over 99% of all the carbon on the planet is in the form of carbonate. And we turn it directly into limestone, as opposed to the traditional method on the right, where CO2 is captured, purified, liquefied, transported, and then deposited underground like a waste material. And it's anticipated that it won't leak out. And this has been embraced by the petroleum industry because CO2 is used to push into wells to push more oil out. And so a lot of the government subsidies that are aimed at climate change are actually subsidizing the oil industry. Like here in the United States, Occidental Petroleum bought carbon engineering for $1 billion to capture CO2 and pump it into their oil fields to get more oil out. And they get a subsidy from the US government for doing that. Something about what we do here also is we're able to completely change the way carbon is managed once it's captured. And it's hard for people to realize it, but the real challenging issues are not capturing carbon. There are many ways to do that. It's finding something to do with all that carbon once you have it and keep it from going back into the atmosphere. And we're talking about very large logistical projects. Like in the diagram here, The blue line represents a plant where Blue Planet is located near a CO2 source. And on the left, there are three CO2 sources depicted: a low carbon power plant like a natural gas plant, low carbon industry, could be a cement plant that's practicing modern methods. Or on the bottom, it could be a refinery, and when they're making the hydrogen, they're producing a lot of CO2. But we have the ability, just like it's happening in the ocean in nature, to pump our capture solution through simple water pipes, not high pressure lines or anything, just simple water pipes out to um, a CO2 production location and put it through an absorber. And you may know a company called Sulzer, a Swiss company. Sulzer is one of our largest investors, and they build these large absorbers where you can put a liquid and a gas through and transfer the CO2 and convert it into CO3. So the solution going back from the CO2 source now has carbonate in it. And the brown color represents the solid. And here we're making the calcium carbonate solid and shipping it out. Now, a big part of what we're doing is we're not making a cement or a cement alternative. We're making the rock that goes in concrete, and I'll explain that a little. So if you go to a cubic meter of concrete on the top, and you look at where is the carbon dioxide coming from the production of the concrete, a small amount of it is coming from the sand and the gravel, the fine and coarse aggregate, and most of it's coming from the Portland cement. And some of it's coming from the water, but in the additives, but very little. So when we think about concrete as being a climate problem, what we're really talking about is the Portland cement in it. So that's why almost all the work's been on Portland cement. But in fact, if you look at the composition of concrete, it's mostly not cement. It's mostly limestone or other, aggregates, sands and gravels. So on the bottom here is depicted the actual mass of the different materials that make up the concrete. And what you can see is there's more sand and gravel than anything else. And so what we're doing is not trying to lower the amount of CO2 that comes from the production of Portland cement, because it's relatively small. What we're doing is we're using CO2 we've captured to make limestone aggregates that can be stored in the concrete rather than mining in an open pit mine and transporting it to a ready mix plant to make concrete. We have essentially an urban quarry where we're synthesizing the limestone in situ. The process is fairly simple. I'll just go through it quickly. In our plant on San Francisco Bay, we bring in recycled concrete. We leach the calcium out of it. We put it through the gas absorption system and turn it to carbonate. We precipitate a calcium carbonate precursor material that's only found in biomineralization. And we have ability to have it cure into a hard rock in minutes. We're able to use a broad range of CO2 sources. We're not really sensitive to any particular CO2 source. So, whether it's a coal plant or a natural gas plant or a biodiesel plant, they all produce a CO2 emission source we can capture CO2 from. And it's true of refineries, steel, cement. We've even mineralized direct air capture. But all of these add up to about 20 gigatons if we were to capture all of these. So there's a large potential. And the calcium sources we use are also quite diverse and varied in our system. Currently in San Francisco, we're using returned and demolished concrete. We've used cement kiln dust, steel slag, fly ash from coal plants, bauxite from aluminum. They all have the calcium component that we need. And what's interesting is what's left over is still usable in concrete as an additive to concrete. In fact, it's better because it cleans it up when we dissolve the calcium out of it. But we've also used native rocks that are high in alkalinity, igneous mafic rocks. We're using produced water in one location, which is the water that is produced when oil is pumped out of the ground. And most of what's pumped out is ancient seawater, not oil. And then they have the responsibility of managing that. And it's very high in calcium, typically high in alkalinity, and it's unlimited raw material source. But these are the three things we're producing in San Francisco: a normal weight aggregate, which is very common in concrete. A lightweight aggregate. We use this in Terminal 1 at San Francisco International Airport. It's typically used where you need lightweight concrete. And the sand that we produce is left over after we bleach the calcium out. So getting a little more into the concrete itself, there are a number of properties that we have to maintain in the concrete. Concrete's the most used building material in the world. And we have the ability to produce a carbon negative concrete. And we use this rating system called the Carbon Star rating system, which is now a North American ANSI standard on characterizing the carbon intensity of a yard of concrete. But depicted in this bar diagram on the left is a typical, in this case, cubic yard of concrete. And if we take what's called the coarse aggregate, the gravel of Blue Planet, which is synthesized limestone, and limestone is 44% by mass CO2. The molecular weight of calcium carbonate is 100. The molecular weight of CO2 is 44. So in every kilogram of limestone we make, there's 440 grams of CO2 that are permanently mineralized in the crystalline state. So by replacing the gravel part here depicted in the middle, in the blue, where it says Blue Planet Coarse Aggregate, it offsets the carbon footprint of the Portland cement and the standard concrete almost completely and brings it down to carbon neutral, the concrete. If we also, and this is depicted on the right, replace the sand component, we bring it down to negative 490 pounds per cubic yard. So the built environment becomes where we're storing the CO2. We recently started pouring a new mix design where we're making the most negative concrete that's ever been made. And what we typically do when we do a new mix design, we pour a small slab so people can come and see it. But we do all the necessary regulatory testing on the concrete. You can see in these broken sections, the white is our aggregate, and the gray is the sand and the cement component of the concrete. I'll just mention that because we're making it in a process that's quite akin to native biomineralization, there's a adaptation in the crystals that make them highly reflective. And I'm not going to go into it, but there's a great interest in the architectural community in making highly reflective concrete to avoid the urban heat island. There's a high number of efforts in the works right now to address the concrete climate problem. And this was an analyst a French analyst who did this analysis. And what it does is it looks at the different efforts to mitigate the carbon intensity of concrete. And group A are people working on aggregates like us. Group B are people trying to make new cements. A lot of my patents are on new cement, but that's not what I'm working on now. C, there's groups working on cement additives. And D, there's groups working on taking purified CO2 and infusing it into molten concrete. And they're all interesting, but they have different impacts. So if you go back to the carbon star rating system and you look at kilograms of CO2 per meter square cube, what you find is most of the efforts to address the carbon intensity of concrete simply reduce it a little bit, but don't really solve it until you start using the main component of the concrete, which is the aggregate, which you see on the far right. And a lot of these processes only work if they're using renewable energy. If they use typical energy off the grid, they don't work at all in terms of the carbon. They put out way more carbon than they're sequestering. Others of them only work if they're given government subsidies, which really, most of the world will never have government subsidies, and most of the world is where most of the CO2 is coming from. So building a model around dependent on a government subsidy, the idea is that'll stimulate new technology, but if it's a fundamentally unsustainable method, I'm not sure it's helping that much. So going back to our model, we're working on deploying this model around the world. And here's an example. This is up in Le Havre in France. And the reason Blue Planet has the potential to have such a large impact is not just because it's the largest market in the world other than water. It's that the existing infrastructure of mankind is well adapted to accepting this solution as a major solution for carbon dioxide. And this diagram depicts the same elements as this cartoon does. Here you can see the yellow is existing CO2 producers. The blue is the Blue Planet solution being shipped around. And the red are solid materials which are already produced on site. And there are many, many of these sites all around the world. They're called pre-Panama Canal ports. And they've been there in some cases for centuries. And in many cases, they're not being used because they can't accommodate the big ships that are brought in now. And so there's an immediate opportunity. So in a case where it might normally take a decade to get all the permits, everything lined up, in San Francisco, we were able to get up and going in 18 months, which is a huge element. And this just depicts how we've been developing it over the last few years, where we're currently developing it. And we have a methodology where we send a team out to a location and we look at many aspects. Are the raw materials there? Are the transportation there? Is there a market for the concrete close up? And we're able to make the pricing of the aggregate competitive with regular mined aggregate as well. Our basic approach is to go directly to the specifiers. So for example, at San Francisco Airport, the architects of the airport specified that they wanted Blue Planet concrete. And then the general contractors had to go to concrete producers that would accept the Blue Planet mix designs for the job. And if they didn't, they lost the bid. That normally what's done is, a project is designed. The very last thing they do is go out and get the bids on the concrete, like a commodity. We're doing it just the opposite. We're going to the specifier and owner first. And here's an example. This is San Francisco Airport Terminal 1. The airport put in the specification that they wanted carbon negative Blue Planet aggregate in their concrete. The reason I bring that up is what's different about this is money already being spent. The airport was already going to buy 1 million yards of concrete. So this is a way that governments, poor and rich, can use their procurement power to save the planet. Because by the airport specifying a carbon sequestered aggregate, that resulted in thousands of tons of CO2 being permanently sequestered in the airport. But it was money they were already going to spend. So rather than an offset or something else, this fits right in with the economics of what they're doing anyway.
May I ask, how much did they have to pay on top of the usual concrete they would buy alternatively?
Nothing. I mean, we could easily charge a premium though. The large, in our neighborhood, we've got Google, what was Facebook, Microsoft, companies that are building very large data centers right now. And we could charge 100 times what, we're charging, they'd still pay it because they're very concerned about their carbon footprint. But no, we're not charging anything above market price. The way it goes is it goes from our plant to the ready mix plant where the water and sand is at, and then it's transported out to the job site. So there's a long chain there. There's also there is a voluntary carbon market that is something we're planning to participate in, although we're not fully dependent on it. But anyway, this is what the specification at the airport says. To bid on the job, at the very minimum, the concrete has to have a carbon intensity of 200 pounds per cubic yard. A regular yard of concrete, 600 pounds. So it's already 1/3 of what you would normally anticipate. But then they have another requirement that it be 0. And even a third one where it's negative 200 pounds per yard, which is negative 90 kilograms per yard. And that one will always win the bid, even if the price is similar. This is how they competitively win the bid for the concrete. In California leads the United States and maybe the world in a lot of these policies. And we're currently crafting a number of different bills and policies in Sacramento, our capital, around embodied carbon, procurement, incentives, cap and trade that we have on mineralization, and a number of others. And it's very common for, and I can cite many different legislations globally that were first drafted in California and implemented. And so this is where we believe things are going. Like I mentioned, there's a very large voluntary carbon market out there right now, which we're also participating in. But we've also won the endorsement of virtually every concrete organization we've talked to, you know, from architectural firms to there's a group called iMasons, which is a collective of all the large data center builders led by Microsoft, and you know they're very concerned about the carbon produced by the electricity running the data centers, as well as the carbon produced from the concrete used in the data centers. And this is a possibility to, when you first build a data center, actually have a net carbon negative. And then over the operational history of the data center, to work away at that, if you will, carbon bank account, so that the net carbon intensity of the data center over, say, a 3 or 4 decade lifetime would never go above negative. It would stay negative over by being amortized over the many decades and alleviate the whole problem. And so we're working with these groups to develop mixed designs and trying to fund them with advanced purchase commitments. We've worked with a number of different CO2 producers and people in the field, from oil companies to cement companies to large industrial companies to concrete ready-mix companies to equipment providers, biofuels refineries, aggregate companies, energy companies. So we have a large network of people interested. But the question is, how do you go from where we are at the kiloton scale up to at least the megaton scale? How do you actually do that? And it requires a lot of modeling to really kind of start to understand that. But here are different sources of CO2 and the average amount of CO2 coming from these different sources. And we make certain assumptions. You know, we're assuming these plants are about 400 kilotons. And we've been approached by engineering firms all over the world that want to build these plants at their clients. And so we're working with large energy engineering firms, different feedstock providers, carbon emitters, you know, we financed our whole plan in San Francisco, for example. But these are the groups that are approaching us. We've got a number of patents, and we're looking at what it's going to take us to get to our first gigaton of sequestration and how it will look over 5 years. We've assembled quite a management team of people that have worked for me for some of my previous companies that I have a long history with. We've got an amazing set of advisors that are helping us in the various different areas. And I think that's it.